Every 4 years, one nation gets handed the greatest prize in global sport, the right to host the World Cup. Millions of citizens celebrate this news with genuine national pride, rarely questioning the hidden political machinery that made this celebration possible in the first place. But behind every winning bid lies a war few fans ever see, fought not with players, but with politics, money, and secret promises. Some nations have lied, bribed, and manipulated their way into hosting rights, while others were mysteriously overlooked despite seemingly perfect qualifications. This uncomfortable truth rarely makes headlines during the celebration, yet it shapes football's biggest decisions far more than most supporters ever realize or discuss. This is the untold history of how host nations are really chosen, a story filled with corruption, rivalry, and shocking backroom deals. It is a story that reveals football's true character, blending genuine passion with cold political calculation in ways most fans never fully realize. From the very first tournament in 1930 to the unprecedented three-nation hosting of 2026, this battle has never been simple. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how football's biggest stage became one of the most contested political prizes on earth. You will also understand why some nations spend decades chasing hosting rights, while others seem to win them almost effortlessly through hidden influence. Let us begin at the very beginning, with a tournament almost nobody wanted to host at all. In 1930, FIFA needed a host nation for the very first World Cup, yet almost every major European power refused to participate. Uruguay, celebrating 100 years of independence and having just won Olympic football gold twice in a row, volunteered enthusiastically to host. FIFA awarded Uruguay the tournament partly because the small South American nation promised to cover all traveling teams' expenses entirely. Despite this generous offer, only 4 European nations made the long, expensive ocean voyage across the Atlantic to compete in Uruguay. This early tournament revealed a pattern that would repeat for decades. Hosting decisions were rarely just about football merit alone. This pattern established a template that FIFA, intentionally or not, would follow repeatedly throughout the organization's long and complicated history of tournament hosting. Money, convenience, and political relationships have shaped hosting decisions since the very first ball was kicked in World Cup history. Italy hosted the very next tournament in 1934, and evidence later suggested political pressure from Benito Mussolini's fascist government influenced FIFA's selection. Mussolini viewed hosting the World Cup as a powerful propaganda opportunity, using the tournament to showcase fascist Italy's supposed strength and unity. Some historians allege that referees during that tournament faced political pressure, ensuring Italy's controversial path to their first World Cup title. This early example set a troubling precedent, showing how political power could potentially influence football's biggest stage from the very beginning. France hosted the 1938 tournament next, chosen partly because European nations wanted to keep the World Cup close to home after Uruguay's distant location. This decision angered several South American nations, who felt Europe was unfairly dominating hosting selections despite promises of rotation between continents. This growing tension eventually forced FIFA to formally acknowledge the need for fairer geographic distribution, though genuine change would take many more decades to arrive. This early rivalry between European and South American football powers would continue shaping hosting politics for decades throughout World Cup history. Even today, echoes of this historic rivalry appear whenever hosting decisions favor one continent over another, reigniting old debates about fairness and representation. World War II forced FIFA to cancel the tournament entirely in both 1942 and 1946, demonstrating how global politics could completely halt football's biggest event. When the tournament resumed in 1950, Brazil hosted, building the massive Maracanã Stadium specifically to showcase the nation's ambition on the world stage. This enormous stadium, designed to hold nearly 200,000 spectators, symbolized Brazil's determination to prove itself as a rising football and economic power. Fast forward to the modern era, and hosting wars became significantly more sophisticated, involving massive financial bids and secretive lobbying campaigns. The 2018 and 2022 hosting votes remain the most controversial in World Cup history, forever changing how fans view FIFA's selection process. In 2010, FIFA simultaneously awarded Russia the 2018 tournament and Qatar the 2022 tournament in a single dramatic announcement. Both decisions immediately sparked outrage, since neither nation possessed extensive football infrastructure and both faced serious human rights criticism from international observers. Qatar's selection proved particularly shocking given the nation's extreme summer heat, small population, and complete lack of existing World Cup-ready stadiums. Investigative journalists later uncovered evidence suggesting some FIFA Executive Committee members may have received payments or favors influencing their hosting votes. Michel Platini, a powerful FIFA official at the time, later admitted he voted for Qatar following a private meeting with French political leaders. This revelation suggested that international diplomacy and business relationships, not football merit, may have decided one of history's biggest hosting votes. The United States, England, and other bidding nations expressed public frustration, believing their technically superior bids were unfairly overlooked for political reasons. England's bid team reportedly spent millions of dollars preparing what many considered the strongest technical bid, yet received only 2 votes from FIFA's executive committee. This shocking result fueled widespread speculation that hidden agreements, rather than genuine merit, determined the outcome of that controversial hosting vote. Journalists and football officials from multiple countries began publicly questioning FIFA's entire hosting selection process following this deeply controversial dual announcement. Some bidding nations even considered legal action, though ultimately most decided against directly challenging FIFA's authority over hosting decisions in court. The 2015 FIFA corruption scandal fully exposed how deep this hosting war corruption actually ran within football's governing institutions. United States federal investigators arrested multiple FIFA officials, uncovering a pattern of bribery connected directly to World Cup hosting decisions spanning decades. Wire transfers, secret bank accounts, and recorded conversations revealed a shadow economy where hosting votes were allegedly bought and sold. This scandal forced FIFA to implement dramatic reforms, including expanding the hosting vote to all member federations rather than a small executive committee. This reform aimed to prevent a small group of officials from being bribed or pressured by wealthy, powerful bidding nations. The 2026 hosting decision became the very first major test of these new, more transparent voting reforms following the corruption scandal. In 2018, FIFA's full membership voted overwhelmingly to award the United States, Mexico, and Canada joint hosting rights for 2026. This joint bid defeated a rival bid from Morocco, marking the first time 3 nations would co-host a single World Cup tournament together. The voting process for 2026 involved over 200 member federations, each casting a public vote visible to journalists and observers worldwide. This transparency represented a dramatic shift from previous decades when a small group of executive committee members voted in complete secrecy behind closed doors. Supporters of this reform argued that public voting, with clear accountability, would make bribery and secret deals significantly more difficult to arrange successfully. Critics remained skeptical, noting that wealthy nations could still influence votes through diplomatic pressure, trade relationships, and promises of future political or economic cooperation. Despite these lingering concerns, most football observers agreed the 2026 voting process represented meaningful progress compared to the deeply secretive scandals of previous decades. Morocco had actually bid for the World Cup 5 separate times throughout football history, facing repeated disappointment despite genuine passion and investment. Many football fans across Africa viewed Morocco's repeated rejections as evidence that hosting decisions still favored wealthier, more politically connected nations over passionate footballing regions. The joint United States, Mexico, and Canada bid emphasized existing infrastructure, financial stability, and reduced risk, arguments that ultimately proved persuasive to voting member federations. This victory represented a shift toward practical, infrastructure-focused bidding, though critics noted wealthy nations still hold inherent advantages in this supposedly reformed process. Let us explore some genuinely fascinating facts about hosting wars that reveal just how political this process has always been. England hosted and won the World Cup in 1966, yet conspiracy theories about biased officiating still circulate among football fans. Internationally today, the controversial goal that helped England defeat West Germany in the final remains debated by football historians and statisticians even decades later. South Korea and Japan made history in 2002 by becoming the first co-hosts in World Cup history, sharing matches across both nations. This co-hosting arrangement required unprecedented diplomatic cooperation between 2 nations with a historically complicated and sometimes tense political relationship. Brazil's successful 2014 hosting bid faced massive public protests as citizens argued government spending on stadiums ignored urgent healthcare and education needs. These protests revealed growing public skepticism about whether hosting the World Cup genuinely benefits ordinary citizens in host nations. South Africa's historic 2010 hosting victory represented the first time an African nation hosted football's biggest tournament, a landmark moment for the entire continent. Nelson Mandela personally championed South Africa's bid, viewing the tournament as a powerful symbol of the nation's transformation after apartheid ended. Interestingly, South Africa had actually lost a previous hosting bid for the 2006 tournament in one of football's most controversial voting scandals ever recorded. South Africa was widely expected to win that 2006 vote, yet Germany secured hosting rights after a New Zealand delegate mysteriously abstained from voting entirely. This abstention, which many believed would have gone to South Africa, sparked outrage and accusations of behind-the-scenes political pressure from European football powers. The delegate later faced intense scrutiny, though the true reasons behind his surprising abstention have never been fully or officially explained to the public. This controversy directly influenced FIFA's later decision to award South Africa the 2010 tournament instead, partly as compensation for this earlier disappointment. This example perfectly illustrates how a single vote, influenced by unclear circumstances, can completely reshape football history and national destiny. Similar controversies have surrounded numerous other hosting votes throughout history, with losing nations frequently alleging unfair treatment or hidden political influence. Spain and Portugal's joint bid for 2018 ultimately lost to Russia, despite many analysts considering their combined technical proposal significantly stronger and more football-ready. England's repeated hosting bid failures, despite the nation's deep football history and modern infrastructure, have fueled ongoing frustration among English football officials and fans alike. Some English football executives have publicly suggested that historical tensions with FIFA leadership contributed to their nation's repeated hosting disappointments over multiple bidding cycles. These persistent grievances demonstrate how hosting wars create lasting resentment, shaping international football relationships for years or even decades after each individual vote concludes. The bidding process itself has become increasingly expensive, with nations spending tens of millions of dollars simply preparing and presenting their hosting proposals. Australia reportedly spent over $40 million on their unsuccessful bid for the 2022 World Cup, receiving just one single vote in return. This staggering result became one of the most cited examples of how bidding processes could waste enormous sums without any meaningful return. Indonesia was stripped of hosting rights for the Under-20 World Cup in 2023 after political controversy involving the participation of Israel's team. This incident demonstrated how geopolitical tensions, unrelated to football itself, could still dramatically influence FIFA's tournament hosting arrangements even today. China has repeatedly expressed interest in hosting a future Senior World Cup, viewing the tournament as a powerful tool for international prestige and soft power. Egypt, despite possessing passionate football culture and reasonable infrastructure, has never successfully secured Senior World Cup hosting rights throughout football history. Some analysts argue this reflects broader patterns where politically stable, wealthy nations receive preferential treatment during FIFA's evaluation and voting processes. Let us examine the deeper historical rivalry between South America and Europe. Since this continental competition has shaped hosting politics for nearly a century, South American nations hosted the World Cup 4 times between 1930 and 1978, while Europe hosted significantly more often throughout the same period. This imbalance frustrated South American football officials who argued their continent's passionate football culture deserved greater hosting representation on the global stage. FIFA eventually introduced continental rotation policies, attempting to ensure hosting rights spread more fairly across different regions and footballing cultures worldwide. However, critics argue these rotation policies were inconsistently applied, with wealthy nations still receiving disproportionate hosting opportunities compared to developing football regions. Africa waited until 2010 for its first hosting opportunity, despite decades of passionate football culture and numerous nations expressing genuine interest in hosting. This long wait fueled ongoing conversations about whether FIFA's hosting selection process genuinely values footballing passion or primarily prioritizes financial and political considerations instead. So why does understanding these hosting wars actually matter to ordinary football fans watching from their homes around the world? Hosting decisions shape which nations receive massive infrastructure investment, global attention, and decades of tourism benefit from successful tournaments. When these decisions are influenced by corruption rather than merit, taxpayers in losing bid nations may have wasted enormous sums for nothing. Citizens in winning host nations also deserve transparency, since their tax dollars ultimately fund stadiums, transportation, and security for the entire tournament. Understanding this history helps fans critically evaluate FIFA's claims about fairness, transparency, and genuine merit-based selection processes going forward. It also explains why certain nations with passionate football cultures, like Morocco, have been repeatedly denied hosting opportunities despite strong bids. This hosting war history reveals football's uncomfortable intersection with global politics, diplomacy, and international power dynamics that most fans rarely consider. Recognizing these patterns empowers fans to demand greater accountability. From football's governing institutions, pushing for genuine reform rather than superficial promises, the story of hosting wars is ultimately a story about who holds power in global football and how that power gets exercised. Consider how hosting decisions affect ordinary citizens directly, since massive public spending on stadiums often diverts funding away from schools, hospitals, and essential infrastructure. Brazilian citizens protesting ahead of the 2014 World Cup famously carried signs asking why their country could afford stadiums but not basic public services. This tension between national pride and practical governance represents one of the most significant hidden costs of hosting football's biggest tournament. Similar protests have emerged in nearly every host nation since, revealing a consistent pattern of public skepticism regarding the true value of these enormous tournaments. Winning hosting rights also creates lasting legacy questions, since some host nations struggle for decades afterward with unused stadiums and unpaid infrastructure debts. Losing bidding nations face different consequences, having spent enormous sums on bid preparation with absolutely nothing tangible to show for their efforts afterward. This win or lose entirely dynamic creates enormous financial risk for any nation seriously considering a World Cup hosting bid in the modern era. Understanding these stakes helps ordinary citizens engage more critically when their own governments pursue expensive, high-risk hosting campaigns in the future. Journalists covering these bidding wars have increasingly demanded independent financial audits, arguing that public money deserves far greater scrutiny before hosting commitments are made. Some countries have begun requiring public referendums before committing to World Cup hosting bids, giving citizens direct say over these enormous financial decisions. This growing demand for democratic accountability represents a meaningful shift in how nations approach the enormous financial gamble of hosting football's biggest tournament. As more citizens demand transparency, future hosting decisions may finally begin reflecting genuine public interest rather than purely political or financial calculation. As we approach the historic 2026 tournament, hosting wars continue evolving, with future tournaments already sparking early political maneuvering and lobbying efforts. Saudi Arabia has already been controversially awarded hosting rights for 2034, following a bidding process that critics argue lacked genuine competition or transparency. FIFA's decision to award 2030 hosting rights across 6 different nations spanning 3 continents, including Spain, Portugal, Morocco, and South America, surprised many football observers. This unprecedented 6-nation arrangement effectively eliminated competitive bidding entirely, since only one bid emerged for the tournament's centenary celebration in 2030. Critics argue this consolidation of hosting power among a small number of pre-approved nations undermines FIFA's stated commitment to fair, competitive bidding processes. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia's successful 2034 bid faced almost no competition after several potential rival nations withdrew before the formal bidding process even began. Human rights organizations have specifically criticized this decision, citing ongoing concerns about labor conditions and human rights records within Saudi Arabia. FIFA has defended these decisions as part of broader efforts toward regional development and global football growth, though skepticism remains widespread among journalists and fans. Only continued scrutiny and public pressure will determine whether these newer hosting arrangements genuinely serve football's growth or simply consolidate power further. This decision has sparked fresh debates about human rights, transparency, and whether FIFA's promised reforms genuinely changed anything since the 2015 scandal. Football journalists continue investigating these newer hosting decisions, applying lessons learned from the corruption scandals that shook the sport a decade earlier. This ongoing scrutiny represents an important form of accountability, even when FIFA's official processes fail to fully satisfy critics and independent observers. Will future hosting decisions finally prioritize genuine football merit, Or will political influence and financial power continue determining football's biggest prize? Only time will reveal whether FIFA's reforms create lasting change, or whether hosting wars simply evolve into new, less visible forms of influence. What remains certain is that hosting the World Cup will always carry immense political weight, regardless of official rules or stated reforms. Every future bidding cycle will likely face similar questions, scrutiny, and skepticism, regardless of how many reforms FIFA implements along the way. This permanent tension between football's ideals and football's political reality defines hosting wars, and will likely continue defining them for generations to come. Football fans, journalists, and historians will keep watching closely, documenting each new chapter in this long, fascinating, and often troubling story. The next time a nation wins hosting rights, remember, this long, complicated history of politics, money, and power struggles behind that celebration. Understanding this history does not diminish the joy of hosting nations, but it reveals the true complexity behind football's biggest political prize. Perhaps the most important lesson from this hosting war history is that football has never existed purely as sport, separate from global politics and money. Every tournament host reflects a complicated mixture of genuine football passion, national ambition, financial calculation, and sometimes uncomfortable political compromise behind closed doors. As fans, recognizing this reality allows us to celebrate hosting nations while still asking hard questions about fairness, transparency, and genuine accountability. Future hosting decisions will likely continue facing similar scrutiny, especially as FIFA expands tournaments and hosting rights become even more valuable and contested. Nations considering future bids must weigh genuine football passion against enormous financial risk, political scrutiny, and the possibility of wasted investment entirely. This delicate balance will continue shaping which nations pursue hosting rights, and which nations quietly decide the risk simply is not worth it. The history of hosting wars teaches us that football's biggest prize has always required more than passion. It requires power, money, and political relationships. If this video helped you understand the hidden political history behind World Cup hosting decisions, make sure you subscribe for more deep football analysis. Drop a comment below and tell us which hosting decision in World Cup history you believe was the most controversial of all time. Share this video with a friend who loves football, because understanding these hidden political battles helps every fan appreciate the sport's complexity. See you in the next video, where we uncover another hidden story behind the biggest tournament in football history. Until then, remember that every World Cup celebration carries a hidden history of politics, power, and decisions made far from any football pitch.